One single drop of water. That's all it takes to shatter the strongest human mind and reduce a warrior to a sobbing, broken shell begging for mercy. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about torture, about pain, and about the terrifying fragility of the human psyche. This isn't just the story of Chinese water torture, it's the scientific blueprint of how to destroy a human soul, drop by drop, second by agonizing second. And the most horrifying part, it was never even Chinese. Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into history's darkest moments. Today we're exploring one of the most psychologically devastating torture methods ever devised, a technique so brutal that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to understand how it systematically destroys the human mind. But here's what will shock you. Everything you think you know about Chinese water torture is a lie. The origins, the methods, even the name itself. It's all been twisted by centuries of myth and Hollywood dramatization. Today, we're going to uncover the terrifying scientific truth behind this psychological weapon of mass destruction. Let's start by destroying the first myth. Chinese water torture wasn't invented in China. This is one of history's greatest misattributions, and the real story is far more sinister than you could imagine. The year was 1480. Bologna, Italy. A brilliant lawyer named Hippolytus de Marseillais was walking through his garden when he noticed something that would change the course of human cruelty forever. He watched, mesmerized, as a single drop of water fell repeatedly onto a stone, slowly but inevitably carving a perfect hole through solid rock. In that moment of twisted inspiration, de Marseillais realized something horrifying. If water could break stone, what could it do to the human mind? He had just conceived what would become one of the most psychologically devastating torture methods in human history. De Marseillais was no ordinary man. He was one of the most respected legal minds of the Renaissance, a scholar of Roman law who understood the intricacies of human nature and jurisprudence. His legal practice dealt with the complexities of confession, testimony, and truth-telling in an era when physical evidence was scarce and human testimony was everything. Perhaps this background gave him unique insight into the psychological vulnerabilities that his water torture method would so ruthlessly exploit. The irony is chilling. A man sworn to uphold justice became the architect of one of history's most psychologically destructive interrogation techniques. But the real horror was yet to come. By the 1800s, French and German asylums had adopted this technique as medical treatment. They called it the dripping machine, and doctors genuinely believed they were curing insanity by subjecting patients to systematic psychological breakdown. The medical theory behind this barbaric practice was rooted in the now discredited belief in humoral medicine, the idea that mental illness was caused by imbalances in bodily fluids, particularly an excess of blood in the head. Physicians believed that the cold water would somehow cool the overheated brain and restore mental equilibrium. Patients were strapped down, blindfolded, and subjected to precisely timed water drops falling onto their foreheads for hours, sometimes days. The medical establishment of the time believed that mental illness was caused by blood buildup in the head, so they used water torture to allegedly relieve this congestion. These weren't criminals or prisoners of war, these were sick people seeking help, subjected to psychological torment by the very doctors sworn to heal them. The treatment protocols were horrifyingly systematic. Patients would be secured to wooden frames with leather restraints, their heads immobilized in metal braces to ensure the water struck exactly the same spot repeatedly. A bucket positioned above would release water through a carefully calibrated valve system, creating drops of precise size and temperature. The medical professionals administering this torture kept detailed records of their patients' responses, noting changes in behavior, speech patterns, and what they termed cooperative tendencies. What they were actually documenting was the systematic destruction of human psychology in real time. Patients who entered the asylum with treatable conditions like depression or anxiety would emerge, if they survived, as broken shells of their former selves, exhibiting what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative episodes, and complete psychological collapse. Dr. François Loret, a prominent French psychiatrist of the 1840s, became one of the most notorious practitioners of water torture as medical treatment. His published case studies, written with clinical detachment, describe patients screaming, begging, and eventually falling into catatonic states after prolonged sessions. Lore genuinely believed he was performing cutting-edge psychiatric medicine, carefully documenting what he saw as therapeutic breakthroughs when patients became docile and compliant. The reality, of course, was that he was witnessing the complete psychological surrender that occurs when the human mind can no longer cope with systematic torture. So how did this Italian invention become known as Chinese water torture? The answer lies with the most famous magician in history, Harry Houdini. In 1911, Houdini created his most dangerous act yet, the Chinese water torture cell. He would be suspended upside down in a water-filled glass tank, his feet locked in stocks, his body completely submerged. The audience would watch in horror as he seemingly drowned before their eyes, only to miraculously escape at the last second. When Houdini first performed this death-defying act in Berlin on September 21, 1912, the crowd was so terrified that several people fainted. The name Chinese water torture stuck, and soon the entire Western world associated this psychological weapon with ancient Asian cruelty, despite having no connection to China whatsoever. Houdini's choice of the name Chinese was a calculated marketing decision that played into Western stereotypes and fears about Eastern mystery and cruelty. In the early 1900s, anti-Asian sentiment was widespread in Europe and America, and associating his act with Chinese torture added an element of exotic danger that thrilled audiences. The irony is that traditional Chinese interrogation methods, while certainly harsh by modern standards, were actually more focused on psychological pressure through social shame and loss of face rather than the systematic sensory manipulation that characterizes water torture. Houdini's performance was theater, but it was based on real torture techniques that he had studied extensively. The magician was obsessed with understanding every aspect of restraint and escape, which led him to research historical torture methods with scholarly dedication. His private journals, discovered decades after his death, contain detailed sketches and notes about various torture devices, including precise measurements and mechanical specifications for water torture apparatus. Houdini understood that the psychological impact of his performance came not just from the physical danger, but from the audience's subconscious recognition of genuine torture elements. Now we come to the truly horrifying part, the science behind why this torture method is so devastatingly effective. Modern neuroscience has revealed the precise mechanisms by which Chinese water torture systematically destroys human consciousness. Recent studies on torture survivors have shown that psychological torture creates specific patterns of brain damage. The left central executive network, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making and emotional control, literally begins to malfunction under prolonged stress. Dr. Belinda Liddell's groundbreaking 2022 research at the University of New South Wales examined the brains of 99 torture survivors using advanced functional magnetic resonance imaging. What her team discovered was nothing short of terrifying. Torture doesn't just create psychological symptoms, it physically rewires the brain's neural networks. The study revealed that torture survivors show significantly altered connectivity between brain regions responsible for executive control, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. These aren't temporary changes that heal with time. They represent permanent alterations to brain architecture that can persist for decades after the torture ends. The first weapon is anticipatory anxiety. Your brain is constantly trying to predict when the next drop will fall. Every second that passes without a drop increases your stress exponentially. Your nervous system floods with cortisol and adrenaline, but there's nowhere for that energy to go. Within minutes, your heart rate spikes to dangerous levels. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Your body enters fight or flight mode, but you can't fight, and you can't flee. This creates a psychological feedback loop that amplifies every sensation. The anticipatory anxiety mechanism exploits a fundamental feature of human neurological architecture, our brain's predictive processing system. Under normal circumstances, Your brain constantly generates predictions about future events based on past experience, allowing you to prepare appropriate responses. This system evolved to help our ancestors survive by anticipating dangers and opportunities. But Chinese water torture weaponizes this survival mechanism against itself. When the timing of water drops becomes unpredictable, your brain enters a state of constant alert, continuously generating false predictions and experiencing the physiological stress response associated with each failed prediction. Neuroscientist Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on predictive brain function helps explain why this torture is so effective. When our predictive systems are overwhelmed, the brain begins consuming enormous amounts of energy trying to maintain coherent models of reality. Under torture conditions, this energy expenditure becomes unsustainable, leading to cognitive exhaustion and eventual system breakdown. The victim's brain literally burns itself out, trying to predict the unpredictable. The second mechanism is learned helplessness, a psychological phenomenon discovered by Martin Seligman in the 1960s. When a human or animal is subjected to repeated negative stimuli they cannot control or escape, their brain literally rewires itself to accept powerlessness. In Chinese water torture, the victim knows exactly what's going to happen. Another drop will fall, and another, but they are completely powerless to stop it. This creates a cascade of psychological surrender that can break even the strongest minds. Seligman's original experiments with dogs revealed that learned helplessness isn't just a behavioral response. It involves actual changes in brain chemistry. Animals subjected to inescapable shock developed depression-like symptoms and showed altered levels of neurotransmitters, including serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. The same neurochemical changes occur in human torture victims, creating a biological basis for the psychological surrender that makes Chinese water torture so effective. But the learned helplessness effect in water torture goes beyond Seligman's original research. The torture creates what psychologists call global helplessness. The victim doesn't just learn that they can't escape the water drops. They begin to believe they can't control anything in their environment. This generalized sense of powerlessness extends to all aspects of their psychological functioning, creating a complete collapse of agency and self-efficacy. Traditional Chinese water torture wasn't just about the water. Victims were also subjected to sensory deprivation. Bound in darkness, unable to move, with only the sound of their own breathing and the periodic splash of water, their minds became hyper-focused on every tiny sensation. That single drop of water becomes the entire universe. Every splash feels like an explosion. The cold water spreads across the skin like acid. The victim's perception becomes so heightened that each drop feels like a physical blow. The sensory deprivation component of Chinese water torture draws on research pioneered by Dr. Donald Hebb at McGill University in the 1950s. Hebb discovered that when humans are deprived of normal sensory input, their brains begin generating internal stimuli to compensate, leading to hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive disintegration. In water torture, the controlled sensory environment creates a state where the victim's attention becomes completely focused on the torture stimulus, amplifying its psychological impact exponentially. Dr. John Lilly's research on sensory deprivation tanks in the 1960s revealed that humans can begin experiencing severe psychological distress within just a few hours of sensory isolation. The brain, deprived of its normal information processing tasks, begins turning inward and generating increasingly disturbed thought patterns. When combined with the stress of repeated water drops, this inward focus creates a psychological pressure cooker that can lead to complete mental breakdown. But here's where the true genius of evil reveals itself. The most effective form of Chinese water torture doesn't use regular timing, it uses completely random intervals. After the MythBusters tested Chinese water torture on television, they received an email from someone claiming professional knowledge of the technique. The message was chilling. Randomizing when the drops occurred was incredibly effective. If you couldn't predict it, we found we were able to induce a psychotic break within 20 hours. This aligns perfectly with operant conditioning research pioneered by B.F. Skinner and later refined by researchers studying torture psychology. Predictable stimuli can actually become soothing. The brain adapts and creates coping mechanisms. But unpredictable stimuli create maximum psychological stress because the brain cannot prepare or adapt. When drops fall at random intervals, sometimes 3 seconds, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes 3 minutes, the victim's mind cannot find any pattern or rhythm to hold on to. They exist in a state of constant hypervigilance, waiting for the next assault on their psyche. The randomization principle exploits what neuroscientists call temporal uncertainty, one of the most powerful stress-inducing factors in human psychology. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research on stress physiology shows that unpredictable stresses create more severe and lasting psychological damage than predictable ones, even when the unpredictable stresses are objectively less intense. The human brain can adapt to almost any consistent pattern, but randomness creates a state of permanent stress activation that eventually leads to system breakdown. Modern torture research has revealed that the most psychologically destructive interrogation techniques combine physical discomfort with temporal unpredictability. Corbeau's Declassified in the 2000s show that agency psychologists specifically designed enhanced interrogation protocols around these principles, using unpredictable timing for temperature changes, noise exposure, and physical positioning to maximize psychological impact while minimizing obvious physical evidence. In 2008, the MythBusters team conducted the most scientifically rigorous test of Chinese water torture ever filmed. What they discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Build team member Carrie Byron volunteered to be the test subject, strapped to a custom-built torture device with medical supervision. The experiment was designed to be as safe as possible. She could stop at any time. She was among trusted friends, and paramedics were standing by. Before beginning, researchers established baseline psychological measurements. Kari's stress levels, anxiety responses, and emotional state were all documented to track the torture's effects in real time. The MythBusters apparatus was constructed with meticulous attention to historical accuracy. The team consulted with historians, medical professionals, and even former military interrogators to ensure their device replicated the psychological conditions of actual Chinese water torture. The restraint system used leather straps and wooden frameworks based on designs found in 16th century torture manuals. The water delivery system was calibrated to produce drops of precise size, temperature, and impact force based on documented historical accounts. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the neurosurgeon who monitored Kari during the experiment, used advanced medical equipment to track her physiological responses in real time. Heart rate monitors, blood pressure cuffs, and electroencephalography equipment measured the immediate effects of the torture on her cardiovascular and nervous systems. What the data revealed was a textbook example of acute stress response escalation. Within minutes of beginning the torture, Kari's body was showing signs of extreme physiological distress, typically associated with life-threatening emergencies. After just 15 minutes, Kari reported mild anxiety and stress, not unexpected for such an unusual situation. But the real psychological assault was only beginning. The research team noted that her initial responses were consistent with normal stress adaptation. Her body was attempting to adjust to the unusual circumstances. However, the continuous nature of the water drops prevented this adaptation from occurring, creating a state of persistent arousal that grew more intense with each passing minute. At the 30-minute mark, Kari's responses began showing signs of psychological strain. Her speech patterns changed, becoming more rapid and less coherent. Her body language showed increasing agitation, with involuntary muscle tension and repetitive movements. Most concerning was the change in her cognitive responses to simple questions. Tasks that should have been automatic were requiring visible effort and concentration. At the 1-hour mark, everything changed. When asked about her stress levels, Kari's response was immediate and alarming. Severe. Extreme. Her voice was strained, her breathing rapid, and you could see the psychological pressure building behind her eyes. The medical monitors showed her heart rate had increased to over 140 beats per minute, well above normal resting rates, and indicative of severe stress response. Her blood pressure readings were approaching dangerous levels, and EEG data showed patterns consistent with acute anxiety disorders. And then, at approximately 90 minutes, the psychological dam burst. Carrie experienced a sudden, overwhelming panic attack. Despite knowing she was safe, despite being surrounded by friends, despite having complete control over the situation, her mind simply broke. The attack was so severe that the medical team immediately considered ending the experiment, even before Carrie requested to stop. "I didn't expect going into this that I was going to freak out and start crying in front of everybody," she later admitted. "The restraints totally made me lose it. I just had a sudden claustrophobia attack." The panic attack represented a complete breakdown of Carrie's rational cognitive processes. Despite intellectually knowing she was safe, her limbic system, the primitive brain structures responsible for survival responses, had taken control and was generating overwhelming fear responses. This is a classic example of how torture bypasses rational thought and attacks the fundamental neurological systems that maintain psychological stability. Carrie's breakdown revealed a crucial element that many people overlook: the psychological impact of physical restraint. It wasn't just the water causing her distress, it was the complete loss of bodily autonomy. The restraints triggered what psychologists call entrapment trauma, a specific type of psychological injury that occurs when individuals feel completely powerless to escape threatening situations. This form of trauma is particularly severe because it attacks the fundamental human need for agency and control. To test this theory, Adam Savage subjected himself to the same water torture, but without restraints. He was free to move, free to leave, free to control his environment. The result? He lasted over 3.5 hours with minimal psychological distress. The difference was stark. Without restraints, Adam described the sensation as merely annoying, like someone's got their finger on this spot on my forehead. With restraints, Carrie experienced complete psychological breakdown in half the time. Adam's experience revealed the crucial role of perceived control in psychological resilience. Even though he was subjecting himself to the same physical stimulus, cold water drops falling on his forehead at regular intervals, his ability to move, adjust his position, or stop the experiment at will completely changed the psychological impact. And this aligns with decades of research showing that perceived control is one of the most important factors in determining whether stressful experiences become traumatic. This aligns with trauma research showing that loss of control is often more psychologically damaging than physical pain itself. The human mind can endure incredible physical hardship when it maintains some sense of agency, but remove that control entirely, and even minor discomfort becomes unbearable torture. Dr. Judith Lewis Herman's groundbreaking work on trauma psychology emphasizes that the core element of psychological trauma isn't the severity of the experience, but the victim's sense of helplessness and loss of control during the event. But what does Chinese water torture actually do to the brain? Recent neuroscience research on torture survivors has revealed the devastating long-term effects of psychological torture. A groundbreaking 2022 study examined the brains of torture survivors using advanced fMRI scanning. What researchers found was shocking. Torture doesn't just traumatize victims, it physically rewires their brains. The study revealed that torture survivors show disrupted dynamic functional connectivity between laterally aligned networks that serve top-down control functions and midline networks that underpin internal self-referential processes. In simple terms, torture damages the brain's ability to regulate emotions, make decisions, and maintain a coherent sense of self. The networks responsible for executive function become hyperconnected to areas managing internal psychological processes, creating a state of constant internal chaos. The neurological damage caused by psychological torture is both extensive and persistent. Brain imaging studies show that torture survivors have significantly smaller hippocampi, the brain structures responsible for memory formation and emotional regulation. They also show hyperactivity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, which remains in a constant state of high alert even years after the torture ends. Perhaps most disturbing is the damage to the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive function, decision-making, and impulse control. Doctor,